All right, let's talk about a man whose whole life was basically one big quest. A quest to find just one single thing he could be absolutely sure of in a world he felt was built on sand. We're talking, of course, about the philosophical giant Ren'e Descartes.
You've heard this, right? Cogito ergo sum? It's probably the most famous sentence in all of Western philosophy. And for Descartes, this wasn't just a clever line. This was his bedrock. It was the one solid anchor he could hold on to when he let every other belief get washed away by doubt.
Because, behind that one famous line, there's this incredible and, well, ultimately tragic story. A story of a guy who literally tried to reboot human knowledge. So let's get into it. Who was this man who dared to doubt everything?
So where did this all come from, this radical doubt? It didn't just pop out of nowhere. It started way back when he was young, growing out of this deep frustration he had with the education and all the answers he was given.
You've got to understand, Descartes was living in two completely different worlds. On the outside, his life was all mapped out. He was born into a good family, his dad was a lawyer, the path was clear. But his inner world, that was a whole different story. He was a sickly kid, and he got into this lifelong habit of just lying in bed in the mornings and thinking. And the more he thought, the more he realized that all the so-called learned men couldn't seem to agree on anything important.
So they sent him to La Flèche, the best school in the entire country. And he studies everything they throw at him. But it all just felt flimsy. It seemed like a huge collection of opinions passed down for centuries. He left feeling totally empty. Well, almost. There was one subject that felt different, one thing that was solid. Mathematics. 2 + 2 is always 4. It's logical. It's certain. And for a mind like his, searching for solid ground, that was a huge revelation. Math became the blueprint for everything he would do.
So, after school, you'd think he'd settle down, right? Nope. Instead, a series of seemingly random events came together and basically handed him his life's mission on a silver platter. First, he gets his law degree, and what does he immediately do? He joins the army. His family must have been totally bewildered, but he wasn't there to be a soldier. He was a gentleman volunteer, which was basically a way to travel, see the world, and get a ton of free time to just think. It was a weird move for sure, but it was all part of his hunt for real knowledge.
And on these travels, he runs into a guy named Isaac Beekman, and Beekman throws this huge idea at him. What if you could use the clean, perfect certainty of math to describe the massive physical world? That one conversation was the spark. It was like a lightning bolt to Descartes' mind, giving his restless intellect a powerful new direction.
And man, once that fire was lit, things happened fast. In 1618, he meets Beekman. Just a year later, bam, he has this series of incredibly vivid dreams, which he takes as a literal sign from God telling him to create a whole new science based on reason. That was it. That was his calling. And by 1628, he'd packed up and moved to the Netherlands to get started.
And what happened next is honestly one of the most productive, intense periods of solitary work in intellectual history. Descartes essentially went off the grid to build his new world of ideas from the ground up.
For how long? 20 years. Just think about that for a second. 2 full decades dedicated to this project, working in almost total solitude.
And he was absolutely ruthless about protecting that focus. He valued his anonymity more than anything. He moved all the time, hardly told anyone his address. He basically locked himself away from the world. Long before we had books about deep work, this guy was the ultimate master of it.
And the results? They were world-changing. This is when he writes his masterpieces, like the Discourse on the Method and the Meditations. And these weren't just books. They were his attempt to take a wrecking ball to the entire existing structure of knowledge and rebuild it on a single, solid foundation, his own reason.
But of course, you can't stay hidden forever when you're that brilliant. Fame eventually caught up with him, and an invitation from one of the most powerful rulers in Europe would lead to a deeply ironic and tragic end to his story.
The invitation was from Queen Christina of Sweden. Now, she was a force of nature, brilliant, demanding, and she decided that she wanted Europe's greatest mind to be her personal philosophy teacher. For Descartes, a man who built his entire life around avoiding distractions, this was a flattering but ultimately a catastrophic mistake.
I mean, just look at this clash. Descartes' entire life, the very routine that fueled his genius, was built around sleeping in and thinking in a warm room. It was a habit he protected for decades. Queen Christina, she demanded her philosophy lessons at 5 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of a brutally cold Swedish winter.
It was a complete violation of the very conditions that made his work possible.
The result was as quick as it was tragic. After just a few months of this new schedule, Descartes, who had carefully managed his delicate health his whole life, got pneumonia and died. He was only 53 years old. The man who reshaped Western thought was basically taken down by an early morning alarm clock. It's just wild.
So after all that, why are we still talking about him centuries later? Because the questions he asked and the way he went about answering them really did mark the beginning of what we think of as the modern era of philosophy.
His legacy is just massive. He basically kicked off modern epistemology, the whole field dedicated to figuring out how we know what we know. He perfectly framed the mind-body problem that philosophers are still wrestling with today. And maybe his biggest contribution of all, he took doubt, something everyone thinks of as a weakness, and he turned it into a powerful tool for getting to the truth.
And that leaves all of us with a challenge, doesn't it? His entire project started by questioning the so-called obvious truths that everyone else just accepted. So the question his life leaves us with is this: what's one assumption you live by? One belief you've never really questioned that might be worth putting to the test?